It was a crisp Saturday morning when I first noticed how the world outside seemed to wake up in its usual fashion, quietly, steadily. The light filtered through the blinds in my living room, casting soft rays on the freshly brewed cup of coffee, sitting on the table beside me. I glanced out the window, the sky a brilliant shade of blue with birds flying in lazy arcs across it. There was something inherently satisfying about the simplicity of it all. Peace, a semblance of calm in the little corner of the world I had carved for myself. The neighborhood had always been a sanctuary, the kind of place where you didn't have to lock your doors at night. People were friendly but not intrusive, each house meticulously maintained, nestled in a suburban environment where everything seemed to be in its place. The homes were all within a certain standard with little variation in appearance, a sea of beige, gray, and cream. For the most part, the Homeowners Association, HOA, kept everything orderly, imposing rules that were meant to maintain the aesthetic of the community. Lawn care, parking spaces, and fence heights. These were the things that the HOA demanded of everyone. For the most part, the HOA was a gentle presence, always there, but never an intrusive force. The rules were clear, and for someone like me, who valued order and structure, life in this neighborhood had been bliss. I could park my car in the driveway without worrying about stray vehicles, and my home's exterior was the exact color I had chosen from the limited palette approved by the HOA. It was predictable, but it was also safe. But that morning, as I stood in the kitchen sipping my coffee, there was a ripple in the water, a disturbance in the otherwise calm, predictable life I had come to enjoy. The ripple came in the form of a new neighbor, to be precise. Karen. Karen had moved into the house next door just a few months earlier, and already her presence was undeniable. There was no subtlety about her entrance into the neighborhood. She made sure to announce her arrival to everyone who would listen, particularly to those who lived on her side of the street. And I was one of her targets, it seemed. At first, it was harmless enough. A few questions here and there about the house, the neighborhood, the usual pleasantries that one would exchange when settling in. But there was something in her tone, a sharpness, that set my instincts on edge. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an energy about Karen that felt off. In the beginning, it was small things, petty really. She didn't like the way I trimmed my hedges. I had always kept them neat, but apparently the shape I'd chosen was too irregular for her liking. Then she commented on the color of my fence, saying that it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic and that it clashed with the paint of my house. I didn't mind much at first. After all, the HOA had never said anything about my fence, so I ignored her nagging. She was just another neighbor with an opinion, and in a place like this, everyone had one. But things began to escalate when she started complaining about the noise coming from my garage. You see, for years, I had been building up my little sanctuary, a garage that I had turned into a small workshop. It was my passion project, a place where I could let my creativity flow, a retreat from the world where I could build things, tinker with old furniture, and even work on small mechanical projects. It was where I could breathe. But Karen didn't see it that way. The hum of a power tool or the buzz of a saw seemed to irk her in ways I couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, she knocked on my door, her usual passive-aggressive smile plastered on her face. "The noise is getting a little much," she remarked, her tone sugary but with an unmistakable undertone of irritation. "It's disturbing the peace around here." I looked at her, surprised. I hadn't thought my garage activities were that disruptive, but I nodded politely, as I always did. "I'll keep it down," I said, trying to appease her. "It won't be for much longer." But Karen wasn't satisfied with that. Every time I worked in my garage, I would see her peeking out of her window, watching me like some kind of watchdog. The smallest noise would prompt her to march over and make another complaint. It was as if my mere existence was an inconvenience to her. At first, I tried to be understanding. I didn't want to cause friction in the neighborhood, and I certainly didn't want the HOA breathing down my neck over noise complaints. But Karen made it clear that nothing I did was ever good enough. She would complain about things that were beyond my control, like the decibel level of a saw or the faint whir of a drill. It was maddening, but I tried to keep the peace. That was until the night everything changed. It had been a long day. I had spent hours in my garage working on a new project, a small wooden table that I was crafting as a gift for a friend. I was almost done, only needing a few more finishing touches before calling it a night. The sun had long since set, and the world outside had grown quiet. I didn't think much of it when I began to notice a faint smell, something burnt, acrid, and unsettling. At first, I thought it was nothing. Perhaps I had left something in the oven too long, or maybe the neighbor was barbecuing. But then the smell grew stronger, more intense, until it filled the entire garage. I stepped outside to see what was going on. My heart sank. The garage was in flames. Thick black smoke was billowing from the roof, curling into the sky, and a harsh orange glow illuminated the night around me. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by shock, unable to believe what I was seeing. My sanctuary, everything I had built, the hours of work, the tools I had accumulated, was burning. I could hear the crackle of the fire, the intense roar of the flames as they licked at the walls, and the sickening scent of wood and metal consumed by fire. Panic set in. I ran towards the hose, trying to douse the flames, but the fire had already spread too far. It was too late. I fumbled for my phone, dialed 911 with trembling fingers, and within seconds I was speaking to the operator, my voice shaking as I described the fire in my garage. "Please hurry," I managed to say. "It's spreading fast." I stood there, helpless, watching as my garage, my refuge, was consumed by flames. It felt surreal. How had this happened? How had everything I worked for been reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes? As I stood there waiting for the fire department, I couldn't help but feel the familiar, gnawing suspicion growing inside me. Karen. She had been the one person who had consistently complained about my garage. Could she have been responsible for this? I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself it was just my mind jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I knew. The timing was too perfect. She had always been obsessed with my garage, always watching from her window, always nitpicking. My every move. The possibility that she had set the fire, whether out of spite or frustration, was too real to ignore. The fire department arrived in what felt like an eternity, but by then, the damage had been done. My garage was unrecognizable, reduced to a smoldering heap of wood and metal. The once vibrant space I had poured so much time and effort into was now just a ruin. As I stood there, surrounded by the charred remains of my workshop, anger bubbled up inside me. This wasn't just the loss of a physical space. It was an attack on my passion, on the hours of work I had invested, and on the life I had tried to build. The injustice of it all settled in my chest like a weight. I had done nothing wrong. I had followed the rules, tried to be a good neighbor. And yet, here I was, standing in the ashes of my own home, wondering how it had all gone so terribly wrong. And that's when I made the decision. I wouldn't let this go. Karen had taken something from me, and now I would make sure she would pay for it. The days following the fire were a blur, and the weight of what had happened pressed down on me with each passing hour. I spent most of my time in a daze, trying to process the destruction of my garage and trying to make sense of everything. The fire department had arrived promptly, but by the time they had contained the flames, there was nothing left of my beloved workshop but smoldering debris. They quickly concluded that the fire was an arson attack, but without witnesses or any physical evidence, it was impossible to pin the blame on anyone specific. The investigators told me they would continue looking into it, but the lack of proof made it difficult to make any accusations. It was all circumstantial, and they couldn't connect the dots. Still, something about it felt deliberate. The timing was too perfect, and Karen's attitude had always been overly aggressive toward anything involving my garage. It seemed like more than just coincidence. The first few days after the fire were the hardest. I was forced to deal with insurance claims, and the paperwork felt like an endless stream of frustration. My insurance adjuster was kind but impersonal, making the process feel more like a transaction than the recovery of something I had cherished for years. The HOA sent me their own forms, asking about the fire, offering their condolences, but it felt like they were more concerned about the potential damage to the neighborhood's image than about my personal loss. They wanted to know if the fire had any impact on the surrounding properties, and they were especially curious if it had anything to do with violations of HOA rules. They seemed to be dancing around the issue, and I couldn't help but feel that they were trying to deflect any blame from themselves. But the worst part was seeing Karen. Every time I walked outside, there she was, her curtains barely parted, her eyes always watching. It was as if she was waiting for me to confront her. The way she observed me made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but feel as though she was gloating, like she knew exactly what she had done, and she was relishing in the discomfort she had caused me. There was no apology, no recognition that her actions had consequences. It was just that cold, unfeeling gaze from behind her curtains. I wanted to confront her, demand answers, but I knew that it would be futile. Karen was the type of person who would deny everything and make herself out to be the victim. She had always been like that, entitled, manipulative, and completely blind to the harm she caused. I knew that trying to speak with her would only escalate the situation, and I needed to keep my cool. But the more I thought about it, the more something inside me began to shift. The anger I felt toward her was growing, but it wasn't just anger. It was a deep, burning need to regain control of the situation. I couldn't let her get away with what she had done. There had to be a way to make things right, to take back what I had lost, and to show her that there were consequences for people like her. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, a thought struck me. A wild idea at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution. What if I bought Karen's property? What if I could take away the very thing that she had used to torment me? The idea filled me with a strange excitement, an adrenaline rush that pushed aside the fear of the unknown. I had always dreamed of expanding my property, maybe even buying a house nearby. But this was different. This wasn't just about acquiring land. This was about reclaiming my peace, my sense of control, and making sure Karen understood what it felt like to have her world turned upside down. She had taken my garage, my sanctuary, my peace of mind. It was time to take something from her. I pulled out my laptop and began researching. I didn't know much about buying properties, but I had been diligent about saving over the years. I had built a stable financial foundation and had some investments that I could liquidate if necessary. After a few hours of looking into local property values and doing some quick calculations, I realized that Karen's house was within my reach. It wasn't worth a huge amount. Her property wasn't in the best condition, and I knew it had been sitting on the market for a while with no real offers. I reached out to a local realtor the next morning, outlining my interest in Karen's property. The realtor seemed eager to help, given that the house had been on the market for several months with no serious offers. I had a few conversations over the next few days, and to my surprise, I managed to negotiate a deal that was much lower than I had initially anticipated. Within a few weeks, after some back and forth and legal paperwork, I was officially the owner of the house next door. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a triumph, but at the same time, a heavy weight settled in my chest. Now I had her property, But what was I supposed to do with it? I hadn't planned for what came after the purchase. Karen was still living there, and I wasn't sure how to handle her reaction. I had bought her house, but the real challenge was going to be getting her out of it. The eviction process seemed straightforward enough, but I quickly realized that this wasn't going to be easy. Karen wasn't the type of person to go down without a fight. I knew that she wouldn't just pack up and leave without creating a scene. In a way, I wasn't sure I cared. She had crossed a line, and now it was time to take a stand. I spent hours figuring out the next steps, how to handle this situation without letting it become public knowledge that I was the one behind it all. I couldn't let Karen know that. I had orchestrated her downfall. I had to play my cards carefully. I contacted an attorney who specialized in real estate and evictions, and we began the process of drafting the official eviction notice. The lawyer was professional and efficient, guiding me through the steps, explaining the nuances of property law and tenant rights. It became clear that I had to follow all the legal procedures to avoid any backlash. I couldn't just show up one day and demand that Karen leave. There were forms to be filled out, timelines to follow, and various legal hoops to jump through. But the process was slow and methodical. Every time I drove past Karen's house, I could feel her eyes on me, watching me. It was unsettling, but at the same time, it gave me a sense of satisfaction. She didn't know that I was the one pulling the strings. She didn't know that I had taken control of the situation. As the days passed, I started to feel the weight of the power shift. The excitement I had felt when I first bought the house was now tempered with a sense of anticipation. I knew that this was going to be a battle. Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight. And while I didn't want to escalate things further, I knew that sometimes, to regain control, you had to show strength. You had to make a statement. One evening, just before sunset, I stood in my newly acquired front yard, staring at Karen's house. It was a strange feeling, standing there, knowing that I owned the property, knowing that I had taken a bold step to reclaim my peace. But it was more than that. It was a statement. I had been pushed too far. I had allowed Karen to take something from me, and now I was taking it back, piece by piece. The realization hit me hard as I stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I wasn't just reclaiming my garage. I was reclaiming my life, my control, my dignity. And Karen was going to feel the weight of her actions. But even as I plotted the next steps, a sense of unease crept in. What had I become? Was this just revenge? Or was it something deeper, something more rooted in the need to stand up for myself, to stop allowing people like Karen to run over me? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to back down now. The first few days after becoming the official owner of Karen's property felt surreal. I had spent so much time plotting and planning that when it finally happened, I almost didn't know how to feel. Was this victory? Was it revenge? Or was it something more complicated than either of those two things? It was a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness, like having completed a long, arduous task that you knew you would never fully forget. I had bought her house, and now it was mine. But as I walked through the rooms, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of discomfort that came with acquiring someone else's life. This wasn't just about property, it was about reclaiming something more personal, my peace, my dignity. But there was still a question that loomed over me. Was I justified in going this far? I had consulted with a lawyer immediately after securing the house, wanting to make sure everything was done by the book. I had every legal right to evict Karen, but I also understood the importance of following due process. If there was one thing I had learned throughout this ordeal, it was that moving forward in the right way would leave no room for retaliation. The last thing I needed was for Karen to turn the tables, creating a mess that would only drag things out longer. The lawyer reassured me. The eviction process was straightforward enough. I would send her the official notices, give her the proper amount of time to vacate, and follow all the necessary procedures. No skipping steps, no cutting corners. Karen, I knew, wasn't the type of person who would just accept the situation. If anything, she'd dig her heels in even further, fighting me every step of the way. But that didn't matter anymore. I was in control now, and I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms any longer. After sending the eviction notice, I waited a few days before deciding to take the next step, delivering the notice personally. I had thought about doing it by mail or leaving it on her doorstep, but somehow I knew it would feel more satisfying to hand it to her in person. Let her see my face. Let her understand that this was not some abstract process. It was real, and it was happening. When I arrived at Karen's house, I could feel the tension building in my chest. The anticipation of seeing her, knowing the confrontation was inevitable, sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I approached her door, knocked 3 times, and waited. Karen answered quickly, her eyes flicking over me with suspicion as she opened the door. The moment she saw the envelope in my hand, I could see the panic flash in her eyes, quickly replaced by anger. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind as she processed the situation. "What do you think you're doing?" she spat, her voice sharp and defensive. "This is my house! You can't just take it from me!" Her reaction didn't surprise me. I had known she wouldn't take this lying down, but the venom in her voice was something I hadn't anticipated. The rage seemed to pulse through her, her face turning bright red with indignation. For a brief moment, I wondered if she might try to physically stop me, but I quickly pushed the thought away. This wasn't about physical confrontation. This was about something much bigger than that. This was about taking control of my life, reclaiming what she had stolen from me. "I'm the new owner now," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. "You'll have to vacate the property. You've been given plenty of notice, and I expect you to comply." My words seemed to hit her like a slap in the face. She stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief, trying to wrap her mind around what I was saying. Her hands were trembling, clenched tightly into fists, but her response was laced with frustration, not surprise. "You can't just do this!" she hissed. "You think you can buy me out and get away with it? You'll regret this, I promise you." The threat hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. There was nothing more to say, nothing to argue. She had already lost, and there was no turning back for her. Her face twisted with the rage of someone who felt completely out of control, and it was in that moment that I realized Karen had always been the one in control. But now, that power had slipped away, and she was floundering. I remained silent, watching her, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction, not because I wanted to see her suffer, but because for the first time in months, I wasn't the one who was powerless. I wasn't the one stuck in a cycle of complaints and petty grievances. I had reclaimed my space, and now it was her turn to face the consequences of her actions. "I don't want to hear any more of this," I said, turning on my heel to leave. "The eviction process has already started. You'll have to deal with it." As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, watching her stand frozen in the doorway. Her eyes followed me, but there was nothing she could do. I had made my move, and now the ball was in her court. I was no longer the one at her mercy, and that, for some reason, felt like the most powerful feeling of all. The next few weeks were a slow, drawn-out process. I continued with the legal proceedings, following each step with precision. The paperwork was overwhelming at times, but I knew it was necessary. Karen's attempts to fight the eviction only delayed the inevitable. Every time I received a response from her lawyers, I could see the anger and desperation behind her words. She claimed that the sale of the property was illegal, that I had no right to evict her. She threw everything she could at me: legal threats, angry phone calls, demands for compensation, but none of it changed the fact that she had no legal ground to stand on. I owned the property, and that meant she had to leave. Her resistance only made me more resolute. There were times when I questioned myself, wondering if I was going too far, if I was crossing a line that I would later regret. But every time I thought about the garage, my sanctuary, my place of peace, I knew that I had done the right thing. Karen had taken something from me that was irreplaceable, and now I was taking something from her. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was about taking control of my own life again. Finally, after several weeks of back and forth, the day arrived. Karen was officially required to vacate the property. She had fought tooth and nail, but in the end, the law was on my side. I could hardly believe it when I received the final notice that she had been ordered to leave. It felt like a victory, but at the same time, a strange emptiness settled over me. The day she moved out, I stood on the front porch of my new property, watching as she loaded the last of her belongings into her car. There was no fanfare, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, almost sorrowful departure. I had expected more from her, more anger, more defiance. But it seemed that the reality of the situation had finally settled in for her. She had lost, and there was nothing she could do about it. As her car disappeared down the street, I stood there for a moment longer, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. It was over. Karen was gone. The property was mine, and I could finally begin to rebuild. But even as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, while satisfying, was also bittersweet. The garage was gone, reduced to ashes, in a fire that had been set by someone I had once called a neighbor. But in the end, it wasn't just about the garage. It was about the principle. It was about standing up for myself, for the things I cared about, and for the right to live my life without fear of someone like Karen trying to tear it apart. I walked back into the house, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. As I entered, the garage, now a clean, open space where I could finally begin anew, I couldn't help but smile. It was finally over. The anger, the frustration, the constant fear of Karen's interference. It was all behind me now. And as I stood there, surrounded by the beginnings of my new workshop, I realized something important. I hadn't just taken back a space. I had taken back my peace. Don't miss more thrilling tales of neighborhood drama and revenge. Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more unforgettable stories.